She checked her phone every morning for almost 2 years. Not because she expected a message out of nowhere, but because some part of her still believed that one day there would be 3 words waiting there. I was wrong. It never came. Have you ever noticed that sometimes the hardest part of being hurt isn't the moment someone lets us down? It's everything that comes afterward. The apology that never arrives, the conversation that keeps replaying in our minds, the quiet hope that one day, somehow, they'll finally understand what they did. I think many of us have spent more time waiting for that moment than we realize. Not because we enjoy holding on, but because a part of us quietly believes that's when healing will finally begin. Welcome back to Slow Down with Brenda. If today's conversation found you at just the right moment, maybe you've been carrying something that doesn't have a clear ending. Someone walked away without taking responsibility. They rewrote the story, denied what happened, or acted as though your pain never existed. And what's been hardest isn't only what they did, it's that life kept moving while something inside you remained paused. We don't often talk about this kind of waiting. It's a very quiet kind. You still go to work, you answer messages, you laugh when something is genuinely funny. From the outside, life looks almost normal. Yet somewhere beneath all of that, there's a small question that never seems to leave. Will they ever understand? Not because we want to punish them, not because we're hoping to win an argument, but because something inside us longs for reality to make sense again. When someone hurts us and never acknowledges it, our minds naturally keep searching for the missing piece. It's a little like reading a novel with the final chapter torn out. You can guess how it ends, you can imagine different possibilities, but part of you keeps turning the pages anyway, hoping the ending will somehow appear. We often believe that understanding comes first and peace comes afterward. So we wait. We wait for the apology. We wait for the explanation. We wait for the admission that we weren't imagining things. At first, that hope can feel comforting. It gives us something to hold on to. But over time, something very subtle begins to happen. Without realizing it, we slowly tie our healing to a decision that belongs to someone else. Their honesty becomes the door we believe we have to walk through before we can finally breathe again. That's a heavy burden to place on another human being. Because people can choose many things. They can choose denial, they can choose silence, they can choose to protect the version of themselves that feels safest. Sometimes not because they're cruel, but because facing the truth asks more of them than they're ready to give. That doesn't make what happened acceptable. But it reminds us of something important. We cannot build our future on choices that were never ours to make. Waiting becomes exhausting for a reason. We're not only carrying the memory of what happened, we're carrying the responsibility of hoping someone else will become a different person. And hope, when it's attached to something we cannot control, can quietly become another form of pain. I don't think anyone teaches us this. Most of us simply assume that closure arrives when the other person finally says, "You're right, I hurt you." But what if closure has been misunderstood? I once heard about a man who kept his ex's last text message unread for over a year. Not to respond, just to know it was still there, proof that the conversation wasn't finished. One day, while clearing space on his phone, he deleted it by accident. He said he braced himself for panic. Instead, he felt something closer to relief. What if closure isn't a gift someone hands back to us? What if it's something that slowly begins the moment we stop asking another person to unlock a door that has always been inside us? That doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending the hurt wasn't real, and it certainly doesn't mean giving anyone permission to keep hurting us. It simply means recognizing that our healing and their honesty have never been the same journey. One belongs to them, the other has quietly belonged to us all along. And that's where everything begins to change, not on the day they finally tell the truth, but on the day we become gently curious enough to ask a different question. What if I've been waiting at the wrong door all this time? A woman I once heard about used to replay one sentence from her father before falling asleep, a single, careless remark from 15 years earlier. She couldn't explain why that sentence out of thousands of others refused to fade. It wasn't the cruelest thing anyone had ever said to her. It was simply the one that never got resolved. One of the quietest things our minds do after we've been hurt is keep looking for an ending. Not because we enjoy revisiting painful memories, but because our brains are wired to search for resolution. When something feels unfinished, it tends to return. A conversation from years ago suddenly comes back while you're folding laundry. A familiar place reminds you of someone you haven't spoken to in a long time. A single sentence, spoken carelessly, echoes far longer than you ever expected. It's easy to wonder why. We've lived through so many other experiences. Why does this one keep asking for our attention? The answer may be simpler than we think. Our minds don't just remember painful moments, they remember unfinished ones. Psychologists call this the Zeigarnik effect, our tendency to hold on to incomplete experiences far more strongly than completed ones. It's one reason unanswered questions can stay with us long after the events themselves have passed. We naturally want stories to have endings. We want loose threads tied together. And when someone hurts us without acknowledging it, our minds quietly begin writing a sentence that sounds something like this. When they finally understand, I'll finally be able to let this go. It's such a human thought. For a while, it can even feel hopeful, because hope tells us that someday, someone else's honesty will bring us peace. But over time, something almost invisible happens. Without meaning to, we slowly place our emotional well-being into the hands of someone who may never choose to hold it with care. We begin measuring our healing against their decisions, their apology, their awareness, their willingness to face the truth. None of those things belong to us. We can influence a conversation, we can speak honestly, we can set boundaries, but we cannot make another person become ready. Sometimes they simply aren't. Admitting the truth would require them to let go of a story they've told themselves for years, and people rarely abandon a story that protects them unless they're willing to face the discomfort underneath it. That realization isn't meant to make us cynical. It can actually make us gentler, not because we excuse harmful behavior, but because we stop expecting someone else to do the emotional work that only they can choose to do. There's a quiet freedom in that distinction. Accountability and healing are connected, but they are not the same journey. Accountability belongs to the person who caused the harm. Healing belongs to the person who experienced it. Sometimes those journeys meet. Sometimes they never do. And if we believe our healing cannot begin until those two paths cross, we may end up waiting far longer than our hearts were ever meant to. That's why waiting can become its own kind of suffering. Not because hope is wrong, but because hope becomes heavy when it's tied to something beyond our control. You may have already noticed moments that gently point in another direction. A morning when you laughed without thinking about what happened. An afternoon completely absorbed in conversation with someone you trust. An evening when you realized hours had passed before the memory even returned. Those moments are easy to overlook, but they reveal something important. Your heart already knows how to move, even if your mind still believes it needs permission first. What if those small moments aren't accidents? What if they're quiet evidence that healing has been trying to begin all along? Not by erasing the past, not by pretending the pain didn't matter, but by slowly teaching us that our future doesn't have to wait for someone else's readiness. That's where the real turning point begins, not when they finally change, but when we loosen our grip on the belief that they have to. And once that belief starts to soften, something inside us finally has room to breathe again. A friend once told me about the week she stopped counting days since the breakup. She hadn't planned to stop. She simply woke up one Tuesday, made coffee, answered 3 emails, and was halfway through lunch before she realized she hadn't thought about him once. No decision, no breakthrough, just an ordinary morning that quietly forgot to hurt. If waiting has a sound, I don't think it's loud. It doesn't usually arrive with dramatic tears or impossible decisions. More often, it sounds like the same question repeating itself in quieter and quieter ways. Maybe tomorrow they'll understand. Maybe one day they'll finally tell the truth. Maybe then I'll feel different. And then, almost without noticing, something unexpected happens. Not outside of us, inside us. It rarely starts with a big decision. Most people don't wake up one morning and suddenly feel completely healed. Healing is usually much less dramatic than that. It begins in moments so small we almost miss them. An afternoon when you realize you went several hours without thinking about what happened. Not because you forced yourself to forget, but because life quietly asked for your attention. A conversation, a walk outside, the smell of fresh coffee, a book that made you pause. Nothing extraordinary, yet those ordinary moments begin creating tiny spaces where pain is no longer the only thing living inside us. This might be one of the most misunderstood parts of healing. We imagine it as the disappearance of pain, but healing is something gentler than that. It's the gradual expansion of life around the pain. The memory may still exist, the story may still be true, but it slowly stops being the center of everything. Imagine placing a small stone into a wide field. The stone doesn't disappear, the field simply becomes larger. Our hearts learn in a similar way. The hurt doesn't always leave first. Sometimes our lives simply grow bigger than the place where it once kept us standing still. There's another quiet shift that often happens around this time. We stop checking. We stop wondering who they're becoming. We stop searching for signs that they've changed. Not because we no longer care, but because we slowly become more interested in the person we're becoming. That change is easy to overlook, yet it changes almost everything. For a long time, our attention may have been turned towards someone else's choices, what they said, what they meant, whether they regret it. Healing gently invites that attention back home, not with force, with curiosity. What do I need today? What helps me feel safe? Who allows me to feel like myself again? What kind of life am I quietly building now? Simple questions, but they point in an entirely different direction. Instead of asking someone else to carry responsibility for our future, we begin accepting that our future is slowly becoming our own again. That doesn't mean we suddenly trust everyone. Healing often makes our boundaries clearer. We become slower to ignore red flags, more willing to leave conversations that don't feel respectful, less interested in proving ourselves to people who have already decided not to see us. There's a quiet confidence growing underneath those choices. Not the confidence that says, nothing can hurt me, the quieter confidence that whispers, if something hurts me again, I know I'll find my way back. That's a very different kind of strength. It's no longer built on controlling what other people do. It's built on trusting our ability to care for ourselves afterward. If today's video is speaking to something you've been carrying quietly, type just one word in the comments below. Whatever word comes to mind right now. Sometimes naming it is the first small step. Peace begins arriving quietly. Not because every question has been answered, but because we no longer believe every unanswered question deserves our constant attention. Some stories remain unfinished. Some people never become who we hoped they would be. Some apologies never arrive, and yet life continues, offering us small invitations to begin again. A meaningful conversation, a peaceful morning, a new friendship, a forgotten dream, a version of ourselves that had been patiently waiting beneath all the noise. Maybe healing has never been about erasing the past. Maybe it's been gently teaching us how to make room for something more than the past. And once our lives begin growing in that direction, something else changes too. Without trying to prove anything, without trying to expose anyone, time starts revealing truths that no argument ever could. There is something about time that we often misunderstand. We imagine it as something that simply passes. Days become weeks, weeks become years. The calendar changes, and we assume that's what people mean when they say time heals. But time doesn't heal us by itself. Time simply creates space. What grows inside that space depends on what we quietly practice each day. If we spend every day replaying the same story, time doesn't necessarily bring peace. It may only make the story more familiar. But if, little by little, we begin choosing honesty over denial, compassion over bitterness, curiosity over certainty, time becomes something different. It becomes a place where new roots can grow. That's why healing often feels so slow. Not because nothing is happening, but because growth rarely announces itself. Think about a tree in early spring. For weeks, it looks almost unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, roots are already reaching deeper. Our emotional lives work much the same way. There are seasons when we feel as though we're standing still, when we wonder why we're not over it yet, why certain memories still catch us by surprise. Maybe nothing has gone wrong. Maybe this is simply what growing looks like. Time also reveals patterns, not immediately but through repetition. A person who avoids responsibility once may just be having a difficult day. A person who avoids responsibility every time is showing us something deeper. The same is true of kindness, trust, and integrity. Character isn't found in one impressive moment. It's found in what repeats. That's why we don't always need to convince people of our experience. Life has a way of introducing everyone to the truth in its own time. Not because justice always arrives exactly as we'd like, but because patterns eventually become difficult to ignore. People eventually stop responding to words and start responding to consistency. There's something comforting in that. We don't have to spend our lives managing other people's perceptions. We only have to keep becoming the kind of person we hope to be. Trying to control someone else's opinion is exhausting. Living according to our values is difficult too, but it asks something different of us. It asks for consistency, not perfection. We don't have to become flawless in order to heal. We don't have to respond perfectly every time. We don't have to pretend we never feel angry or disappointed. We're human. Some days will still be heavy. Some memories will still sting. Healing doesn't fail because of those moments. They simply remind us we're still human. What matters is where we gently return. Resentment or ourselves? I think that question gets easier to answer over time. Not because life becomes easier, but because we slowly learn where peace actually lives. It doesn't live inside another person's apology. It doesn't live inside public validation. It doesn't even live inside being proven right. Peace begins much closer than that. In the small decision to keep choosing who we want to become, even when no one else notices. And perhaps that's the quiet miracle of time. While we were waiting for it to expose someone else, it was also revealing someone we had almost forgotten to notice. Us. Not the version that was wounded, the version that learned to stay gentle without becoming naive, the version that learned to set boundaries without closing every door. Sometimes strength doesn't sound like certainty. Sometimes it sounds like softness. Sometimes it sounds like patience. Sometimes it simply sounds like a heart that no longer needs to prove its own truth. When we begin living from that place, we stop asking whether the past still has power over us. Our attention quietly turns toward the life still waiting to be lived. And that's when we discover something even more surprising. The apology we spent so long waiting for may no longer be the thing we need most. There may come a day that feels almost ordinary. Nothing remarkable happens. No unexpected phone call, no message that begins with, "I've been thinking," no dramatic confession, no long-awaited apology. And yet, something has changed. Not because they finally became the person you hoped they would be, but because you quietly became someone who no longer needs them to. This moment rarely arrives all at once. Many people don't even recognize it when it first appears. It shows up in ordinary ways. Someone mentions their name, and your heart remains calm. You hear a story that once would have reopened every wound, and now it simply passes through you. You remember what happened without feeling the need to relive it. The memory is still there, but it no longer asks for your energy. That's one of the gentlest signs of healing. Not that we forget, but that remembering no longer feels like returning. For so long, we may have believed freedom would arrive the day someone finally admitted the truth. We imagined that hearing, "I was wrong," would somehow restore everything we lost. But even if those words were spoken today, they couldn't return the years you spent growing. They couldn't undo the nights you learned to comfort yourself. They couldn't erase the wisdom that only difficult seasons could teach. Because while you were waiting, something else was quietly happening. You were becoming someone new, learning how to trust yourself again, how to notice the people who make you feel safe instead of uncertain, how to leave conversations that ask you to betray your own peace, how to choose relationships where honesty doesn't have to be earned over and over again. We rarely celebrate that part. Healing doesn't simply help us recover from the past, it changes the way we meet the future. We become slower to ignore our own intuition, kinder toward our own limits, less afraid of disappointing people who only accepted us when we abandoned ourselves. That's not bitterness, that's wisdom. And wisdom has a quiet way of protecting what tenderness alone sometimes cannot. There's another shift that happens here. We stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begin asking, "What kind of life do I want to build from here?" The first question keeps us facing yesterday. The second turns our attention toward tomorrow. Maybe that's why peace feels so different from victory. Victory usually depends on someone losing. Peace doesn't. Peace asks us to stop measuring our future by another person's choices, to stop believing our story cannot move forward until someone else finishes theirs. And maybe that's the deepest form of freedom, realizing that another person's silence no longer has the authority to interrupt your life. Because your life was never waiting for their permission, only your attention. As we come to the end of today's conversation, I'd like to leave you with one gentle thought. If there's someone you've been waiting on, someone you've hoped would finally understand, someone you've quietly believed held the key to your healing, you don't need to force yourself to let go today. All you need is to become curious. Curious about what your life might feel like if your peace no longer depended on another person's readiness. You don't have to answer that all at once. Healing rarely asks for giant steps. It usually begins with one small decision. Maybe today's decision is simply this: to believe that your heart deserves to keep moving, even if someone else never turns around. You don't need their apology to begin again. You only need your own permission. Because your story was never meant to end with another person's apology. It was always meant to continue with your own quiet return to yourself. And perhaps that's what healing has been waiting for all along. Not their honesty, but your permission to begin.